good evening to everyone there in India. It is just morning here in Southern Ontario in Canada. Thank you, Mr. Aurora, for your comments. It's good to hear. I have to say that I must be the least educated among us, possibly being the youngest. But actually, my studies have been more informal than formal. I began studying with my father, Eric McLuhan, in around 2010 or so, and just very informally working as his assistant and traveling with him when he gave speeches, and just getting more and more interested in my family's work. Marshall McLuhan was my grandfather, but he died when I was very young, only 2 years old or so. So much of what I've learned has been since then. Gosh, this is a very big topic with not a lot of time, which is maybe a good thing. Marshall made a comment at his speech once that for the speaker, there never seems to be enough time. Time moves too fast, and for the audience, it moves very, very slowly. So perhaps a limited time is a good thing because it forces you to be a bit concise. Marshall McLuhan was an educator. As Dr. Canozia mentioned, I'm director of what I call the McLuhan Institute, which I started just about 4 years ago in order to carry forward the legacy of Marshall McLuhan, basically because it didn't exist. My father worked with Marshall from the mid-late 60s up until Marshall's death in 1980. And then from 1980 onward, just carried on his own. Pardon me. But there was no formal institution from the family anyway to carry on the work, which is a very specific approach to studying media, which I'll get into in a few moments. But it's interesting that this is the 75th anniversary. 75 years ago, 1946, Marshall started working at St. Michael's College at the University of Toronto, where he would continue for the rest of his career. And it was there a couple years later that he met Edmund Carpenter. And Carpenter and McLuhan together got a Ford Foundation grant to start a seminar in culture and communication. And as a result of this, they produced a journal called Explorations. Explorations ran several years, and I think nine or 10 volumes. And it was an interdisciplinary people from economics, psychology, sociology, English literature, all gathering together to study the effects of technology or media. So Marshall was an educator. His field was English literature, poetry in particular, modernist poetry, Pound, Eliot Yates. And the really interesting thing, which I think remains fascinating, is that Marshall came to study technology through his study of literature. In fact, he first started looking at popular culture in an attempt to get to know his students in the United States, which he felt there was a gap between them. So he took the techniques he learned for studying literature and poetry and applied them to popular culture, to advertisements, to comics. The result of this was in 1951, a book called The Mechanical Bride. And then what he did was he took these same techniques and moved them beyond the content and to the very technologies themselves. And he started to look at the form of communication. He started to look at radio and television and telegraph. And he would later expand beyond communications technologies and look at every human innovation in technology, from your toothbrush to toothpaste, from breakfast cereal to clothing. Everything that people do and create was available for his media studies. One of his first projects in trying to comprehend media was in the late 1950s. He was approached by the National Association of Educational Broadcasters in the US to develop a curriculum for media studies for high school students. This was in around 1958. And in 1960, the result of his work was published in a very, academic kind of report called the Report on the Project in Understanding New Media. during this time, Marshall first said the medium is the message in 1958, much earlier than people assume in 1964 with the book. Now, following this report in 1960, Marshall spent the next several years revising and refining and transforming it into a more popular work, which would become Understanding Media, The Extensions of Man in 1964. And this is a book that gets a lot of coverage, a lot of, I don't know if this is the book Dr. Canozia mentioned he studied, but it's almost required reading in a lot of courses. Just over a year ago, I use Twitter a lot, and I suggested on Twitter that if you're going to teach Understanding Media, you have to give it at least a semester, because a lot of introduction to media communication courses will cover it in maybe one class or even part of a class. And I just felt that the book was too big to gloss over that quickly. So I said, if you're going to do it right, you have to do it in at least a semester. And Twitter being Twitter, somebody responded, well, you should do that. And I said, well, because I'm not a professor, you understand. I do a lot of teaching. I'm invited to give guest lectures in classes like I am doing this week for a friend in Russia and across North America and the world, even in India. But I didn't study to be a teacher. I didn't go to university even. So I consider it an honor to be asked. However, I'm not attached to an institution. But I replied, okay, well, my interest in McLuhan studies is not the theoretical, but the practical. And what I was taught by my father was that Understanding Media is, well, it is two parts. Part one is 7 chapters. And as my father told me, they're tools. The medium is the message, hot and cool, hybrid media, narcissus as narcosis. There are techniques for looking at technologies. Part 2 of the book is 26 chapters, and it's not a coincidence that there are 26 letters of the alphabet. And these are using those tools from part 1 to look at specific technologies like radio, comics, games, television, weapons, all sorts of things. So my interest being in what's practical, I said, okay, I'll design a curriculum to look at the first 7 chapters. And if I get 10 people to sign up, I'll do it. And, you know, honestly, I was betting that 10 people wouldn't sign up. But I quickly had more than 10 people interested, and I was kind of stuck with it. So I partnered with an outfit called Gray Area in San Francisco, who do a lot of technology education online. And I developed this curriculum and I taught it, and halfway through, the students kind of insisted that I do the rest. So I just finished this last week, the 37th class, going chapter by chapter in 3-hour classes with a really in-depth look at Understanding Media, the Extensions of Man. So I'm very interested in media education, especially in what's practical. That's been my focus. This idea of beyond media literacy, Marshall McLuhan didn't use the term media literacy. In fact, at one point in Understanding Media, he talked about media illiteracy. Marshall used the term media ecology. And Marshall took a different approach to the study of technology, an environmental approach. And he said that after Sputnik in 1957, ecological thinking became inevitable. And indeed, it became inevitable for his own studies. And his idea of media ecology, which he introduced in Understanding Media and earlier, is the idea of looking at the environment of effects created by technologies minus their content. For example, I pulled a couple quotes from this book. This is a wonderful book, Letters of Marshall McLuhan from 1987. Just a fracture of the letters he wrote, but he said, right here, to say that any technology or extension of man creates a new environment is a much better way of saying the medium is the message. Moreover, this environment is always invisible, and its content is always the old technology. The old technology is altered considerably by the enveloping action of the new technology. And he says, over and over, I've talked to groups and individuals about new technology as new environment. Only the content shows, and yet only environment is really active as a shaping force. And I like this bit. The fact that literate adults in our world have very simple-minded ideas about media does not prevent these media from having very complex results on psyche in society. I've been trying the last couple of years to find out how to fit McLuhan into media literacy because it seems absent. And this is odd because when you speak with people involved in media literacy, they know who Marshall McLuhan is, and they kind of claim him as one of the figures important to media literacy. And yet his ideas of how technologies operate don't seem to have a place in media literacy. And I'll explain what I mean. A short time ago in the spring, I wrote a piece called Macro Media Literacy. Maybe if I'd been a little more thoughtful, I could have called it meta media literacy, but we can't be too ahead of our times. In any case, this was one of my first attempts to try and fit McLuhan into media literacy. And so I looked at what people consider to be media literacy. And here are a few definitions. A commonly cited definition of media literacy was created at the 1992 Aspen Media Literacy Leadership Institute. Quote, media literacy is the ability to access, analyze, evaluate, and create media in a variety of forms. Okay. It's also called a media and information literacy, critical media literacy. commonsensemedia.org says media literacy is the ability to identify different types of media and understand the messages they're sending. Or Critical Media Project builds upon the previous media literacy efforts in several ways. The emphasis on critical media literacy means that we focus more explicitly on analyzing the politics of representation in media. In these examples, the focus is very obviously on content, specifically on the intent of the creators of the content. So it's a kind of propaganda studies where you're trying to determine what the people are trying to say between the lines. Maybe they're trying to convince you of ideological beliefs. Maybe they're advertisers trying to get you to buy products. And this is important work. I want to be very clear that I certainly have nothing against media literacy. In fact, I believe it's very important, especially for children, to understand that we're being manipulated by people using these various channels to shape our opinions, to influence our purchasing habits. We need to know this, but this is not the total story. As Marshall said, it's the environment. So regardless of whether we're talking about media literacy right now, or whether we're gathering to talk about the latest in veterinary medicine, or Jello molds and vintage whatever, regardless of what we're doing with this right now, Zoom in the last year and a half since Corona has allowed people to congregate and get together, to have seminars and conferences, to conduct classes and communicate and educate. And the effect of that has been very profound. I think it's obvious that going forward, we won't be doing things the same way. Conferences will remain largely online or have largely online components, and there won't be the same pressure on people to travel and things like this. And this has happened regardless of what we're using the technology for. It's the same with the telephone. It's the same with the telegraph or any other major media. While people are busy making content, even while they're busy being critical of content, technologies are quite busy rearranging our senses, our brains, and our societies. And this was Marshall's point, that the effects of technologies happen on two major levels, on the personal and the social. So our exposure to different technologies affect our senses. And when you affect one sense, you affect all the senses. And that affects who we are. It affects our preferences. It affects our tastes in not only content, but clothing and music, entertainment, but also in our purchasing habits, in what is conducive or what is abrasive. And then there's societal implications, how cities were rearranged because of transportation, because of the railroad, because of the highway. This happened regardless of whether you were driving or being driven or where you were driving to. As Marshall said, the meaning and effect of a medium is the subtotal of all its impact upon psyche and society. So Marshall enlarged what we consider to be a medium or media. And if you apply media literacy to clothing, media literacy doesn't have much to tell you. Or if you apply it to footwear or to watches or something like this. But these are all human technologies and innovations that have profound shaping influences on our lives. The watch and the clock, for example, radically changed how we perceive the day, how we operate, our work and study and socialization habits. And this is kind of regardless of any intent behind the makers to influence our behavior. So for me, we need to go beyond media literacy to come up with formal ways of studying these wider environmental effects of technology, but more importantly, on educating people. I do some work in younger classrooms, grade 5 and 6 students, where we look at the effect of the smartphone. And kids that young, almost all of them have one, but they don't realize how entrenched they are in their lives. When they wake up in the morning, it's because their alarm on their phone is going off. And, they check their social media and TikTok and, maybe not Facebook, but Instagram, whatever they're into. They go to school, and when they're on the playground, they're still on their devices checking things. They check the weather. If they have to add something, they open the calculator app. And when I suggest to them that imagine tomorrow you wake up and your smartphone doesn't work, and neither does your friends, and they're never going to work again. What does this mean? And they gasp, they take a breath, and you can hear the shock, because they can't imagine a world without their smartphones. They can't imagine how they would do anything, how they would wake up in the morning, how they would talk to their friends, how they would find out any information whatsoever, how they would do most of the tasks they would do. They would be helpless. And it is a shocking thought. Of course, the older of us here know that we did almost everything just fine before, maybe a little slower, but there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. Still, we don't think of these things until they're removed from us. That's what Marshall talked about, this invisible environment of effects, because so long as everything's running, we don't notice them. And that's where we need to go beyond media literacy. So with some colleagues in Germany, we put out this proposal, call for papers, for this volume to come out in 2023 called Beyond Media Literacy. And I invite anybody here, you don't have to be an academic, although it might help, to consider how to go beyond media literacy. What does media literacy mean if we take out content? You know, if we take out those concerns and we look to the environment, how do we study and how do we educate each other on these effects? And Dr. Canozia hopefully will put up the little thing, contact information. I can always be reached, Andrew at the McLuhaninstitute.com. And I'd love to hear your thoughts. You can reach out to the McLuhan Institute over Twitter, Instagram. I have a YouTube channel. I'm pretty easy to find. So I want to thank you very much for having me here today and embracing this topic, which I think is one of the primary concerns of our time. It's on a level with our climate crisis. This is a mental climate crisis, a sensory climate crisis. And I really appreciate your perspective on it. So thank you very much.